The events forming the basis of this story originate within the wider context of the global conflict that engulfed Europe during the Second World War. After the rapid advance of Japanese forces across Southeast Asia in early 1942, the situation for Allied troops became critical. British garrisons, which included both men and women serving in auxiliary units, found themselves in circumstances where organized resistance was no longer possible. Among those who survived the sudden collapse of defenses were the women who later became internees in camps deliberately hidden from international scrutiny. The core group of future participants in this narrative took shape after the fall of Singapore on 15 February 1942. Women serving in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, communications sections, and medical corps were among those immediately detained by Japanese forces following the capitulation. Their path into captivity was marked by uncertainty. They were initially placed in improvised holding areas, hastily arranged on the outskirts of the captured city. Several weeks later, they were transported to a more structured internment camp on Sumatra, where prisoners from different regions were being concentrated. Conditions in the camp were harsh, even by wartime standards. The women were housed in wooden barracks built from raw bamboo, poorly insulated against tropical rains. A perimeter of barbed wire surrounded the site, with simple guard towers rising above it. Although officially designated as an internment facility rather than a punitive camp, the remote location, lack of communication, and strict limitations turned daily routines into continuous challenges. Food supplies were limited. Prisoners received small portions of rice, sometimes diluted with water into a thin porridge. Additional vegetables were distributed infrequently, and meat appeared only on rare occasions. Many women began keeping a strict count of the calories available to them, rationing everything to preserve their health. In the tropical climate, malnutrition quickly affected their physical condition. Yet one shared desire persisted among them: to learn what was happening beyond the wire barrier, what was happening in the war, who held the initiative, and whether there was any hope of liberation. The absence of information weighed even more heavily than the lack of food. Before captivity, many of the women worked with telegrams, reports, and radio transmissions. They were part of a structure where information was fundamental. Now their world had shrunk to a few hundred meters of land and bamboo walls. Occasionally, vague rumors reached the camp, fragments of overheard conversations, scattered remarks from guards, or guesses based on movements of troops in the surrounding region. But nothing could be verified, and uncertainty bred anxiety rather than comfort. It was in this climate of isolation that the idea slowly emerged, an idea that would later define their quiet form of resistance. A small number of women with experience in radio equipment began to consider the possibility of constructing a rudimentary receiver from any materials they could obtain. These thoughts were exchanged only in absolute secrecy. They were fully aware of the danger. Discovery of any unauthorized device could lead to severe punishment, not only for those building it, but for the entire barrack. Yet it was here, in the Sumatra camp, under conditions of isolation, that a concept took shape which no one outside could have imagined. A group of British women prisoners would eventually attempt to assemble a hidden radio receiver out of scraps of metal, wire, and any material that could be repurposed. The story of their effort was only beginning. As time passed, life in the Sumatra camp grew increasingly monotonous. For the prisoners, days differed only in small details related to food distribution, weather, or the rare movements permitted within the camp perimeter. In such a repetitive existence, the longing for information about the outside world gradually turned into a deep internal need. Each woman had her own reasons for wanting to hear news. Some hoped to learn about the fate of relatives in Britain. Some wanted to understand whether the course of the war was changing. And others simply sought any sense of connection with the world they had been separated from. This shared desire eventually transformed into a concrete idea: the attempt to create a makeshift radio receiver. Most of the prisoners had no technical training, but a few had worked with communication equipment and radio systems before the war. Their knowledge became the foundation of the project, though none of them could foresee how difficult it would be under conditions of scarcity, constant surveillance, and complete lack of proper tools. The first challenge was the acquisition of suitable materials. The camp offered almost nothing that resembled usable electronic components. All metal objects were tightly controlled, and anything potentially valuable was removed or monitored. The women began carefully observing their environment, looking for overlooked fragments, scraps of wire left near fences, old nails, pieces of tin from discarded cans, remnants of broken lanterns, or metal parts hidden in damaged kitchen utensils. Collecting these items was a slow and risky process. Sometimes the women found fragments near the kitchen area, where waste was removed irregularly. Sometimes discoveries were made in decaying storage sheds on the outskirts of the camp. Each piece was examined carefully, because the success of the radio depended on the sum of such fragments. Wire was considered especially valuable, as it was essential for building a coil, the central component of the future device. Interfering with perimeter fencing was impossible, so the women watched closely for opportunities when guards performed repairs and left small offcuts behind. These pieces had to be retrieved quickly and hidden before anyone noticed they were missing. Another critical task was obtaining insulating materials. In the tropical climate, clothing wore out quickly, and the prisoners' garments often reached a state of disrepair. Scraps of fabric or loose threads became crucial resources, providing crude insulation for wires and the exterior of improvised components. Coordination and secrecy became the pillars of the operation. Conversations about the project occurred only when complete privacy was assured. The prisoners agreed never to store all collected materials in one place. Some pieces were hidden in cracks in the wooden walls, others beneath floorboards, and still others inside kitchen containers where they would blend with ordinary household items. Despite the risk, collecting materials gradually took on the character of a quiet ritual. It became a constant reminder that even in captivity, the women could act, observe, and build something meaningful. By the middle of 1943, they had gathered enough basic components to attempt the first stages of construction. They knew the work ahead would be exhausting and technically challenging, but for the first time, their idea took on tangible form. The project began to evolve into a symbol of resilience, ingenuity, and the persistent human need for information, even under the harshest conditions. When the collection of materials finally became sufficient, the next stage began the attempt to build the radio receiver itself. In a camp without tools, electricity, or access to proper metal components, every operation turned into a complex engineering task. The few women familiar with communication equipment understood that they would need to rely on the simplest possible design, a basic crystal receiver requiring no external power source. Yet even such a primitive device demanded components that were practically non-existent in the camp. The coil became the first element they attempted to construct. Using the bits of wire gathered from repair leftovers, the women wound the coil around a wooden cylinder assembled from thin bamboo strips. Bamboo was one of the few materials available, though it required careful handling because of its fragility in humid conditions. To prevent cracking, they wrapped the cylinder in layers of fabric before winding the wire, making the surface smoother and more stable. Thin wooden sticks found in storage areas served as improvised guides to keep the coil even and tightly wound. Next came the challenge of creating a diode. Since an industrial diode was out of reach, the women attempted to make a primitive detector from graphite and a sharp metal contact. The graphite came from the broken core of a discarded pencil found among thrown-out supplies. The metal contact was fashioned from a thin strip of wire extracted from the inner layer of a tin can. Together, These pieces formed a rudimentary crystal detector, reminiscent of the very early radio receivers of the first decades of the 20th century. The antenna presented another serious problem, because it was the most visible component and therefore the most dangerous. The women decided to use the structure of the barracks to conceal it. Above the ceiling ran a series of wooden beams with narrow gaps between them. These gaps allowed them to stretch a thin wire across the length of the barrack, almost entirely out of sight. The work was done late at night, when guard activity was minimal, and background noise masked their quiet movements. The greatest obstacle, however, was the earphone. Without it, the detector would be useless. Industrial headphones were unavailable, and improvised versions required materials the women rarely encountered. A solution emerged unexpectedly during the dismantling of an old lamp abandoned near a storage hut. Inside the lamp, they discovered a small metal diaphragm and a coil with remnants of fine wire. This discovery enabled them to assemble a simple listening device, weak in sensitivity but capable of functioning alongside the homemade coil and detector. The assembly process proceeded slowly, step by step. Thin threads and twisted wire ends held the components together. Without proper tools, the women used the jagged edges of tin cans to scrape contacts clean, while bamboo splinters served as makeshift clamps. Each part was tested repeatedly to eliminate errors. The fragile construction required steady hands and absolute concentration. The designated workspace was a remote corner of the barrack where dim light did not attract attention and the evening noise of the camp drowned out minor sounds. The work was carried out in small groups, allowing one person to remain alert and warn others of approaching guards. Gradually, the device took shape. Visually, it barely resembled a radio, more like an intricate cluster of wires and bamboo fragments hidden under layers of cloth. When the final connection was made, the women realized they had achieved something nearly impossible. Under the constant threat of punishment, with only scraps and improvised tools, they had built a device capable of capturing faint signals from the outside world, signals that could carry the news they longed for. When the construction of the radio receiver was completed, one final step remained, testing whether it could actually function. Preparing for this moment required extreme caution. The women understood that even the slightest mistake could lead to the discovery of the device. They chose a late evening, a period when the camp settled into relative quiet and the guards conducted fewer rounds. During these hours, the muffled sounds of prisoners preparing for sleep created a natural background, masking any faint noise that might arise during the test. The receiver was placed beneath the floorboards, close to wooden beams where it remained effectively concealed. One woman acted as lookout near the barrack entrance, ready to signal if a guard approached. The others gathered around the hidden device. With no instruments to assist them, they relied solely on the sensitivity of the improvised earphone and the precision of their adjustments to the coil. Tuning the receiver required both technical understanding and patience. The women slowly rotated the bamboo cylinder with the wound coil, altering the inductance in hopes of capturing even the weakest transmission. The first attempts produced nothing but faint crackling, barely distinguishable from the ambient night sounds of the camp. Yet none of them considered abandoning the effort. They knew radio waves were traveling around them, and with persistence they might intercept a broadcast. After prolonged adjustments, a thin, intermittent noise emerged in the earphone. The noise gradually shifted into fragments of human speech, fragile and distorted. This was the first signal. It was so faint that the listener had to press the improvised earphone tightly to her ear. Despite the weakness of the sound, there was no doubt. The receiver was functioning, and somewhere far beyond the island, a radio transmission was being broadcast across thousands of kilometers. The words were scarcely intelligible, yet certain fragments could be recognized as English. It was likely one of the Allied stations transmitting wartime news. Realizing this had a profound effect on the prisoners. For the first time in many months, they had proof that the outside world continued to exist, that the war persisted, and that Allied forces were still engaged in the struggle. This moment provided more than emotional relief. It became a new source of internal strength. The women now had the ability to learn about events unfolding beyond the confines of the camp, and this information could reshape their understanding of the war's progress. It strengthened their belief that liberation would eventually come. The first captured signal became a symbol of overcoming the impossible, marking the beginning of a new phase in their hidden resistance. After the receiver proved to be functional, the women faced a new challenge, transforming scattered radio noise into coherent and useful information. The makeshift device could not provide a stable signal, and many broadcasts arrived only in fragments, audible for a few seconds at a time. Even so, these fragments were invaluable. The prisoners began a systematic routine of night listening sessions, trying to capture key words, dates, geographic locations, and any detail that could reveal the broader course of the war. Maintaining secrecy became more critical than ever. Listening took place in small, rotating groups, and the women avoided any changes to their usual daily routines that might draw attention. The schedule of listening was adjusted regularly, and the hiding place of the receiver was changed often. At times, the device remained concealed in a double-bottomed kitchen drawer. At other times, it was placed inside a hollow bamboo support beam. Each relocation required precision, as the construction was fragile and could easily be damaged. Over time, the women developed a system for preserving the information they gathered. Without paper or writing materials, they relied entirely on memory. Each morning, after a night of listening, they reconstructed the fragments by repeating them among themselves until the details were securely fixed in the minds of several members of the group. Particular importance was given to repeated words or dates, which made the information more trustworthy. Gradually, news began to circulate discreetly around the camp. The women were extremely careful. Information was not presented as official updates, but rather as general observations or indirect conclusions about the war. This strategy minimized the risk of attracting suspicion while still allowing essential knowledge to spread. By mid-1943, the prisoners recognized certain patterns in the broadcasts. They learned about Allied progress in North Africa, about the increasing scale of bombing operations over Germany, and about the growing strength of Allied naval forces in the Pacific. These reports brought a quiet but noticeable optimism into the camp. Conditions remained harsh, but the sense of isolation eased. Knowledge that the world beyond the camp was changing helped sustain morale. Radio listening evolved into a psychological refuge. The nightly sessions provided purpose and responsibility. Each captured phrase, no matter how incomplete, carried weight. The women sensed that they were contributing to the emotional survival of the entire camp. The information they gathered reminded them that they still belonged to a wider world, however distant it seemed. Atmospheric disturbances, tropical storms, and fluctuations in signal strength often interrupted the broadcasts, but the women persisted. They continued refining the detector, adjusting the coil, and repositioning the antenna to improve reception. Even minor enhancements demanded significant effort, yet these activities also reinforced their determination. By the end of 1943, the radio receiver had become more than a hidden device. It was the backbone of their internal resistance, a silent companion in their struggle. It allowed them to hold on to reality, to keep hope alive, and to maintain a fragile but vital connection with the outside world. Through this improvised network of shared information, the prisoners preserved a sense of purpose that the camp was never intended to allow. With each passing month, the existence of the hidden receiver became more dangerous. The women understood that they could not rely on luck indefinitely, especially when even a routine inspection might lead to catastrophic consequences. The guards gradually tightened control over the camp, reacting to increased escape attempts reported in other occupied territories. Although the Sumatra camp was not classified as a high-security facility, searches became more frequent, and surveillance grew steadily stricter. Morning inspections were particularly tense. Guards often entered the barracks without warning and examined sleeping areas thoroughly. The women who operated the receiver noticed that the guards had become more attentive to any metal object, even to common household tools. This shift suggested that warnings about illicit activities in other camps had reached the local command, prompting a general increase in vigilance. Complicating matters further was the fragility of the receiver itself. It could not easily be disassembled without risking permanent damage. To protect it, the women adopted a strategy of layered concealment, moving the device between several prepared hiding places. The most reliable location was a narrow gap between two wall panels in the far corner of the barracks. Accessing it was difficult, but this difficulty provided security. The receiver was wrapped in layers of fabric and bamboo to blend with the structure. Despite all precautions, tension in the camp grew steadily. One of the most alarming moments came during an unexpected sanitation inspection at the beginning of 1944. The women knew that such procedures often involved detailed searches. For several hours they lived in anticipation of discovery, preparing themselves for the possibility that the receiver might need to be destroyed instantly. When the inspection finally took place, it was thorough, but ultimately unsuccessful from the guard's perspective. One of the wall gaps was examined, but the concealed device remained undetected beneath its carefully arranged coverings. Each such episode reminded the women of the precarious nature of their work, yet the danger did not weaken their resolve. On the contrary, the receiver had become more than a tool for gathering information. It symbolized their endurance and their capacity to act, even in captivity. It gave them a sense of agency in a place designed to strip them of it. By this stage, the women understood that the risk was approaching its highest point. Yet the more the threat intensified, the more determined they became. The hidden receiver had grown into a quiet act of defiance, surviving against the odds in an environment built to suppress initiative. It continued to operate under constant threat, fueled by the prisoners' commitment to know, to endure, and to hope. At the beginning of 1944, the character of the broadcasts the women managed to capture began to change noticeably. The radio transmissions increasingly contained reports of broad Allied offensives in Europe, intensified air operations, and the gradual weakening of Axis positions in multiple regions. Even when the signals were faint, the structure of the broadcasts allowed the prisoners to identify references to major operations with growing confidence. This gave the information circulating quietly through the camp a new weight. Over time, the women developed a surprisingly effective method of interpreting the fragmented messages they received. By recognizing repeated words, tonal shifts in the announcer's voice, and specific interruptions in the static, they were able to understand when significant updates were being read. Gradually, they reconstructed more complete narratives from scattered fragments. One of the most profound moments came when they detected partial reports of the Allied landings in France on 6 June 1944. Although the reception was extremely weak, the women pieced together enough fragments to grasp the essence of the event. For the camp, this became a symbolic turning point, a sign that the war had entered a decisive phase. The knowledge began to alter the internal atmosphere among the prisoners. Their living conditions remained harsh, yet the psychological impact of the news was transformative. Understanding that Allied forces were moving forward brought a renewed sense of possibility. Quiet discussions spread through the barracks, touching on potential scenarios of liberation. These exchanges occurred discreetly, as openly discussing hope carried its own risks in a place where morale was tightly controlled by circumstance and fear. Despite the mounting danger surrounding the hidden receiver, the women continued to maintain a structured system of night listening. They created a schedule that accounted for fatigue, illness, and the varying health of each participant. Malnutrition and tropical diseases made the task physically draining, but the women showed remarkable persistence. Maintaining the receiver had become a mission that extended beyond the technical. It had become a lifeline. Occasionally, the broadcast carried sobering reports about fierce battles in the Pacific and substantial Allied losses. These fragments served as reminders that the war's trajectory in Asia differed from that in Europe and that liberation might still be distant. Yet the overall direction of the broadcasts made clear that the strategic balance was shifting. This understanding fortified the prisoners' resolve. By late 1944, the women began hearing frequent references to sustained Allied air operations against Japanese bases and supply routes. Although the camp was located far from key military targets, the prisoners occasionally detected the faint rumble of distant aircraft. Such sounds were subtle confirmations that the front lines were moving closer, even if only gradually. Toward the end of the year, broadcasts reported increasing supply shortages within Japanese forces and mounting casualties. The women discussed these developments cautiously, recognizing that such conditions could influence military decisions in the region, perhaps even those affecting the camp itself. The hidden receiver had evolved from a fragile device into a central element of psychological endurance. It not only connected the women to the outside world, but also allowed them to maintain a fragile emotional equilibrium. Each captured broadcast strengthened their sense of continuity with the world beyond the barbed wire. With every night of listening, they felt a little closer to the moment when their confinement would end. By the beginning of 1945, the situation around Sumatra began to shift noticeably. The women who continued to listen to the hidden receiver detected more and more references to rapid Allied advances across Southeast Asia. Broadcasts reported landings in the Philippines, breakthroughs on the Burmese front, and the gradual loss of control by Japanese forces across vast territories. Even fragmented, these updates allowed the prisoners to sense that the end of their captivity might come sooner than they had once believed. The improvised radio receiver required frequent repairs during this period. Humidity affected the contacts, and several components suffered from wear. Yet the women managed to keep it functioning. Despite the constant risk of discovery, the device remained their only window into the outside world. Every evening, they attempted to catch a transmission, hoping for new developments that would illuminate the direction of the war. As the months passed, visible changes appeared within the camp. The guards began to move with less discipline, patrols became irregular, and certain posts were left unattended for long stretches. These signs suggested internal strain and possible shortages within the Japanese garrison. The women observed these changes carefully, weighing their implications. Reduced discipline might signal a collapse in command, yet it could also lead to unpredictable decisions if the guards felt threatened or pressured. In the summer of 1945, the prisoners captured a transmission that would become one of the most significant moments of their confinement. The message was faint but clear enough to convey that Japan had suffered major losses and that Allied operations in the Pacific were accelerating. Although the details were incomplete, the meaning was unmistakable. For the first time, the women began to discuss the possibility of liberation in concrete terms, even if only in private and with extreme caution. The period that followed was filled with tension. Inside the camp, behavior among the guards became increasingly inconsistent. Some appeared distracted, others avoided their usual routines, and several simply vanished from their posts. The prisoners noticed that supply deliveries had become erratic, and that communication with the outside seemed disrupted. These developments, though encouraging, also introduced new uncertainty. In the absence of firm command structures, the reactions of the remaining guards could become unpredictable. By mid-August 1945, the atmosphere in the camp changed dramatically. Over the span of several days, many guards abandoned their positions entirely. Some took personal belongings and walked away without explanation. Others left quietly during the night. The prisoners awoke one morning to find that much of the garrison had disappeared. This silent abandonment became the first unmistakable sign that the war had ended. A short time later, Allied representatives reached the camp and informed the women that Japan had announced its surrender on 15 August 1945. The news brought profound relief, accompanied by a complex mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. Many of the prisoners had endured years of deprivation, illness, isolation, and fear. Yet the hidden radio had allowed them to prepare, mentally and emotionally, for the arrival of freedom. In the years that followed, the women reflected on their secret project as one of the decisive factors in their survival. The improvised receiver, assembled from scraps, wire, bamboo, and fragments of metal, became a symbol of ingenuity under extreme conditions. It allowed the prisoners to maintain a fragile connection with the world, preventing their isolation from becoming absolute. Though the camp itself was eventually dismantled, the memory of the hidden radio endured. It remained a testament to the human capacity to create hope from limited means, to seek knowledge in the face of fear, and to preserve dignity in circumstances designed to extinguish it. For the women who lived through those years, the faint signals captured by their handmade device became proof that even in captivity, the voice of the outside world could still be reached.